it's still well north of 25 million servers that are unsecured. So unfortunately, we'd like to see some improvement in there. We are seeing a drop in percentage of respondents with dedicated security staff for that. It's tough to say what that really means. It could be just that they're shifting that responsibility into the larger security team. So in the mobile arena, we see a huge increase in 4G adoption, no surprise there, right? We've got over half the respondents have now rolled out 4G services globally, so that's pretty significant. And then a strong growth in IPv6 traffic, and we'll take a look at that as well. So let's get into more of the details. All right, as I mentioned before, substantial growth in the largest attacks. I think I got my year wrong. The 100 gig was at 2010, then 2011, 12, 60 gig, and then up to 300 plus in 2013. What's interesting here is that was just the single largest attack that was reported via the survey, but we had lots of other very large attacks reported, anything ranging into the hundreds of gigabits or 200 gigabits and more. And we also know that some of our respondents, they told us in the comments that they didn't report all of the attacks, they only reported the largest because that's how we phrased the question, right? So if you saw a 300 gig attack, but you also saw a 250 and a 210 and 195, you only reported the 309, right? And of course, we saw multiple events well above the 100 gigabit per second range in 2013. And again, now that we're here in 2014, that doesn't, it's probably, we're already a little numb to it because we've already seen even larger attacks so far in 2014, right? So let's talk about, I mentioned I have other sources of data that I'll share with you. So some of you may be familiar with our Atlas sensor net. This is something that Arbor's been maintaining for over a decade. And we have, right now we have about 295 plus global service providers and large enterprises participating, sharing telemetry data in addition to our own sensors that are distributed throughout the global internet. So we're right now seeing a lot of traffic, a lot of attack traffic, and in 2013 so far, the Atlas, in 2013, all of 2013, the largest attack that Atlas witnessed was 245 gigabits per second. So what that tells you is that sensor net didn't see the 309 gig attack that was reported, right? But it did see other large attacks. And we also saw a sharp increase in attacks over 20 gigabits per second. So depends on your measuring stick, but some people say 20 gigabits per second is a significant, very large event. Others would say, not so big, right? Really depends on your perspective and your network resources. All right. So talk a little bit more about Atlas data. I wanted to get something a little more current for you. So this is the latest quarter that we've reported on, the Q1. Obviously Q2 isn't over yet. So some data sets from Q1 2014, looking at just some summary data at a high level. Average DDoS attack that we monitored throughout the first quarter was only 1.12 gigabits per second. And I say only, again, depends on your perspective. That could still be considered pretty significant. Depending on your network. And that came in at about 271 kilopackets per second. And the peak that we monitored so far in Q1 was 325 gigabits per second and 161 million packets per second. So obviously that's a very significant attack. What's interesting to me is if you kind of peel back some of these numbers, and I didn't put every bullet point on here, is that, for instance, looking at Q1 2014, we see all these very large attacks. But when I peel back the layers and I look at the number of attacks that we witnessed that were over 20 gigabits per second, it was 0.5% of all the attacks that we witnessed. And I can tell you, we see a lot of attacks. Right now, I think in the last 24 hours, we've seen over 5,000 DDoS attacks that we've been able to monitor just in the 24 hours. So we're seeing a lot of attacks. So when I say 0.5% of them are over 20 gigabits per second, it's still a significant number, but it's obviously the outliers, right? So it's these average attacks that we're probably more interested in, that we're dealing with on a daily basis. A little bit more detail on the Q1 stuff. So as I mentioned, while it's a small percentage of attacks that are over 20 gigabits per second, it's still an increase over last year. So in just the first quarter, we've seen 1.5 times more of those over 20 gigabit per second attacks than we did in all of 2013. So that is significant, right? And we saw 72 events over 100 gigabits per second just in Q1 of this year, right? So again, that's some pretty staggering numbers, I think, something to be paying attention to. One thing I wanted to break out on this is the NTP attacks, right? So if 2013 was the year of the DNS reflection amplification attacks, 2014 is the year of the NTP reflection amplification attacks, right? So if you look in the first quarter of the year, obviously that was big news, right? And we can see the stats here pretty clearly. When we look at all these large-scale attacks, 85% of the attacks that were over 100 gigabits per second were NTP reflection amplification attacks, right? And those, the average event size of the large attacks was a little over 20 gigabits per second. So clearly, that first quarter large-scale volumetric attacks were driven by NTP reflection amplification, not just the event that Cloudflare reported early in the year, but also obviously copycats following on, using that example and taking advantage of that exploit. All right. So again, a little bit more data on that. If we look back historically at the traffic that we've monitored, looking at the end of 2013, November, early December timeframe, we saw average NTP traffic that we monitored globally was just a little over, about almost 1.3 gigabits per second, right? That's all NTP traffic that we monitor. And then by February, we were averaging over 350 gigs of monitored NTP traffic. Well, obviously that's not time sync traffic, right? That is attack traffic, that is DDoS traffic. And you can see here in the graph, I mean, I don't know how well it shows from a distance, but you can see spikes well up above 700 gigabits per second of attack traffic, right? So clearly, we've got a baseline average of a little over a gigabit per second, and then these massive spikes through the early part of in the first quarter. Now, by March, we started to see that leveling off, but still significantly above 2013 levels, or that sort of baseline of about a gigabit plus per second. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about attack targets. So this is obviously something we're keenly interested in. We ask survey respondents every year to tell us who are the targets, the attacks they see traversing their networks, or the attacks they have to defend against. So not surprisingly, we see that the customers are the most common targets. And really that's network operators from their perspective saying, it's not me that's getting attacked, it's my end customers that are getting attacked. That's the most common target. But we did see a big boost in network infrastructure targets, as I said in that intro. And that's clearly because of the nature of all these large volumetric attacks, right? There probably aren't a whole lot of customers out there that have 300 gigabit connections to the internet, right? So it's hitting the service provider's infrastructure. No surprise there, right? What's interesting to me, though, is if you look in at what you see in the media when you hear reports of DDoS attacks and who's being affected and who's being impacted, who's being targeted, you could easily walk away with the perspective that it's really always focused on financials and on government entities, right? Because that's what we hear the most of in the press. It gets the most traction, right? And interestingly enough, obviously, we did have a big uptake in financial. E-commerce has actually been in the lead for quite some time, right? So just anyone doing business on the internet, not surprised there, right? And go for the money. But what is interesting is that the subscribers and users in general, and meaning service provider customers, are still the top target, right? And have been for quite some time. And I think what that really speaks to is the service providers community, by and large, understands this problem. They understand what they need to do to deal with it, right? They have defenses in place. And so unless we're talking about these outliers or these extremely large attacks, the attackers are doing much more of those crafted, smaller, low-level, low and slow, state exhaustion, application layer type attacks. And that's why you see this trend, right? If they can't break down the walls of the fortress at the service provider, they can't overwhelm the circuits, then they're going to go and they're going to target the end customer. They're going to target the end users, the enterprise applications and services in the data center. They're going to go low and slow, fly under the radar, not fill the network pipes, but try to take out those services instead, right? So, of course, we see that. So talking about application layer attacks, we track that every year as well. And we see, 24% of all respondents said they see application layer attacks, period, of some sort, right? And I'm sorry, I've seen the targeted application layer attacks. 86% saw some type of application layer attack, period. That's a very high number. It's a very significant number. The other change we see is a much bigger focus on web services, right? So we see a huge proportion of attacks against HTTP, against encrypted HTTP, SSL attacks, right? Huge rise. If you look at that for the last 3 years running, we've gone from, 25% to 37% to 54% seeing encrypted attacks in the web services, right? No real surprise there either, but obviously something we want to pay attention to. As more and more applications and services move to the web, as more and more application and services are being encrypted, the attackers are going to go to the same place, right? Okay. So just to back that up with a little bit of Atlas data, again, this is not survey data. The previous was survey data. It's what your peers are telling us and yourselves. But this is actual monitored stuff that we see in the wild, right? So we look at breakout of duration for attacks in first quarter of 2014. We're seeing the vast majority of attacks are very short-lived, less than an hour, right? In fact, the average duration attack duration is exactly an hour, and I don't know why I put 0 minutes in there. Too much detail. Anyway, for larger attacks, average is a little bit shorter, about 55 minutes. And we're seeing for attacks that last longer than 12 hours, it's a very small portion, right? Only about 1.5%. So, interesting numbers there. Something new that we saw this year is for the first time we saw non-initial fragment attacks as the #1 destination. And then after that, of course, you see things like web traffic, right? It's port 80, HTTP, SSL attacks, DNS is in there in the mix as well. So not too surprising. Obviously, you see NTP is a significant portion for the first quarter as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about attack motivations. Again, this is something that we track every single year. No surprise that the front runner continues to be ideological motivations, hacktivism. At least that's the perceived top motivation for the last 2 years, right? So we ask people, what they think. What's really kind of interesting to me and a little bit telling is that the sheer volume of motivations for these types of attacks, right? So, yeah, we're seeing ideological hacktivism sort of coming in at the top. That's a consistent trend for the past 2 years. Well, we've got a whole slew of other reasons, whether it's, a competitive takeout, whether it's, financial gain, whether it's, sometimes it's even just cheating the system, right? You see these gamers are DDoSing the game network, right? Xbox Live and things like that, just to gain competitive advantage to win a game. I mean, this isn't not even for financial gain. It's not politically motivated. It's such a base motivation. It's kind of, I think, a little bit telling that people would go to that lengths just to win an online game. I guess it shows you how into it they are, right? How passionate they are about it. And then we still see, a significant number of attacks are being used as a distraction, right? So that's an interesting trend. We talk about advanced persistent threat campaigns. Those have been around for a long time and continue to be an issue, right? But more and more we're seeing examples where the APT campaign may have been going on for a year, right? I mean, they've infiltrated the network a long time ago. The malware has spread. Right? It's hiding, it's laying low, it's propagating throughout the network. They're setting up, they're staging for exfiltration. They're slowly siphoning data off, right, to some internal server where they can stage it and then exfiltrate to an external server and get away with the goods, right? And then what we see is when it's time for that exfiltration stage, when it's time to get the payday, that's when the DDoS attack comes in, right? So they're using it obviously as a smokescreen, as a cover, right? So everybody's busy defending that massive volumetric attack that's like kind of like a natural disaster, right? And in that confusion and in that massive effort that has to take place to deal with it, that's when they exfiltrate. And in some cases, it can be very effective distraction, so that, until the dust settles, then you go back and you realize, uh-oh, something happened, right? So obviously that's when the forensic tools are going to become really important to go figure out what happened. But we're definitely seeing a trend in that, and that is continuing. All right, so threats and concerns. We asked this about threats on your existing network and then concerns over the next 12 months. So I mentioned we look a year back and a year forward. This has been consistent for at least 3 years running. DDoS attacks are a top concern or experienced threat, both looking back a year and looking forward a year. What's interesting, and this is a new statistic for this year, the number 2 spot for outages, the cause of outages, was misconfiguration or failure. So I think that's one that often gets overlooked, right? Everybody's focused on what is the security threat, what is the new malware, what is the new attack vector that's coming at me, am I prepared for that? Is my vendor prepared, are my vendors prepared for that? Are they, keeping up with the bad guys? And I think it's easy to overlook how often something like a failure or a misconfiguration can be just as disastrous, right? So I was kind of surprised to see it at that high. Like 55% told us they saw outages due to that, those reasons. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Then obviously still having issues with bandwidth congestion, or that's not necessarily attacks. It's just could be a lot of reasons for packet floods that just actual legitimate traffic that's like a flash crowd, or some event happens and everybody rushes, right? And then bandwidth congestion is a much bigger concern this year. I think with the proliferation of video and streaming services and other things, we're chewing up a lot more bandwidth. Our end users are chewing up a lot more bandwidth. So I think obviously it's a constant concern, but it's up about 2x from last year. And then of course the going forward, that concern about misconfiguration or failure is ranking 4th. So it's interesting that the outages due to misconfiguration and failure went up to the number 2 spot, but the concern about it looking forward stayed at number 4. So I'm not sure what that tells us. I think maybe it tells us we're just a little too optimistic about the failures and the misconfigurations. But it'll be interesting to see where we land on that next year. All right, mentioned DDoS being a top priority. Obviously, we ask, what are your customers asking you? You see demand for DDoS detection and mitigation services? How is that demand tracking with your customer base? Are you seeing more demand, less demand? And so 62% of respondents this year told us they were seeing increased demand for mitigation and detection of DDoS services from their providers, and about 35% seeing the same as in previous years. So basically, only 3% said the demand went down, so it's probably statistically insignificant, I would say. All right, so we also ask operators what they see on their corporate networks, threats and concerns about things they see on their corporate networks. Top threats this year, as last year, botted and compromised hosts, right? The bad stuff that gets through that you're not able to stop, that you find after the fact. That's obviously a serious concern. It took the top spot. We saw about a 50% increase in the number of reported advanced persistent threats found on their network in the last year. So 20% said they found them last year, in the previous year, and 30% said they found them on their networks in 2013. So that is no surprise with that having gone up, with respondents saying they found more threats on their network. No surprise they're more concerned about that in 2014 looking forward, right? And then advanced persistent threats remain a second place top concern going forward into the next year, well, this year, I should say. All right, I wanted to take a minute. Heartbleed has been a hot topic for a while. mean, it's kind of died down. I still get questions about it. Probably you guys do too, time to time still. But I thought I'd just throw up a little bit of our scans that we were able to monitor around the actual event, right? So, as I'm sure you all know, on April 7th, the vulnerability was announced, right? So we thought it'd be interesting to take a look and see whether or not anyone's taking advantage of this vulnerability immediately after it's been announced, right? So we looked at our Atlas data, which is our real-time monitoring system, and we looked at the SSL scans for the 3 days after the announcement, right? And what you'll see right away is a huge spike in SSL or encrypted HTTP scans on the Tuesday and Wednesday, the 2 days following the announcement, right? And you can see there actually the largest percentage of them were sourced from China and then followed by US and Great Britain. Not really surprising, but interesting to see that telemetry. And then by day 3, by Thursday the 10th, it had already dropped off significantly, right? So, by, I don't know, 4-fold, it had dropped off. Now still, the sources didn't really change, right? So you see the top sources are still China, US, UK, but clearly it dropped off pretty quick. So as soon as the vulnerability is announced, there's a flurry of activity, and then it drops off pretty quick. And actually, we're still seeing those scans. People haven't given up. People are still looking for those unpatched servers out there if they exist. But obviously, that flurry of activity right when the vulnerability was announced. Probably not too surprising, but kind of cool to look at the actual telemetry. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about BYOD, or bring your own device proliferation. We've been tracking this for a couple of years now, since we saw the trend emerging. We see continued increase in this, no surprise. We have an increase last year, or in the last survey, 63% said they're allowing, or their organization allows BYOD devices on the internal network. That's gone up to 71% in the latest survey. And yet, we see well over half tell us they don't have a way to monitor or identify these devices, right? So we're letting these devices on our networks, but we don't necessarily have good control over them. Network access and identity management systems or network access control and identity management systems were the top 2 methods that people were using to try and identify these. But when over half tell us they're not doing anything, right? They're just letting the devices on the network. To me, that's a little bit scary, because this is a device that you don't have any control of. You don't know where it goes. You don't own it. You don't know if it's patched. You don't know what other networks it's been on when it comes into your network. We happen to know, it's been reported there's well over 1 million discrete instances of malware now available on the Android platform alone, right? And of course, it's the most predominant platform. So, there's plenty of threats out there, and, it would keep me up at night if I had to deal with these devices on my network. So we asked what they see as a security risk there. 13% of respondents tell us they've already had a security breach attributed to bring your own device policy, or to those devices, right? And 39%, nearly 40%, tell us they don't know if they've had a breach attributable to BYOD because they don't have the visibility into it. So, I mean, for me, I think that's something to be very concerned about. I think it's really it's a tough dilemma, I think, that a lot of organizations are facing, right? BYOD is here. It kind of forced itself on us, right? We maybe didn't necessarily want to allow these devices on our networks, but they're here, right? We couldn't stop it. They're very popular with everyone across the organization, whether it's executives, middle management, individual contributors. I mean, everybody. The convenience is amazing, right? And the productivity gains we can get, we can do things from anywhere on the go with these devices is fantastic. But it comes at a price, right? And it's a whole lot harder to dictate policy on a device that you don't own, right? And you just don't have control over. So take a little bit of a look at IPv6, some trends that we've tracked. Only a little less than half, I guess, told us they actually have an IPv6 visibility solution. And consistent with last year, the top perceived threat for IPv6 is traffic floods or DDoS, and that's really, I wouldn't expect that necessarily to be any different from IPv4, right? We do know that we've seen an increase in IPv4-6 feature parity as a concern has gone up. And now in second place above misconfiguration, right? So when people think about problems on their IPv6 networks, they're saying, well, I've got all these vendors, right? And in IPv4, I have all these great, baked-in security features, functionality that have been hardened and tested over the years. But in the IPv6 stacks, many vendors still don't have a complete implementation, right? So a lot of the mechanisms that I rely on in IPv4 just aren't available to me in IPv6. And so that creates, I think, some concern over, rightfully so, over, how am I going to get control over that? How am I going to have visibility? How am I going to make that as secure as my IPv4 systems? No real surprise there. You'll see, I've got a slide coming up. We'll talk about the adoption and the growth of IPv6 networks, and I'm sure you guys probably all live it and breathe it. You know the story. IPv6 is something that we're all going to have to move to. We're all in that process at some point or another, and yet the total adoption rates are still relatively low, right? I'm sure you see that in your own networks. So take a little bit of a look at that, the IPv6 traffic growth. So it's kind of an interesting statistics if you look at it, right? So the largest reported volume of traffic monitored was 20 gigabits per second by an individual responding, right? That's pretty massive when we consider that last year the largest reported volume was 3 gigabits per second, right? And when we look at our Atlas data, so not what our survey respondents say, but what we actually monitor, we've seen a tenfold increase in total IPv6 traffic, right? So that's 445 gigabits per second of IPv6 traffic that we monitor in total, versus about 4.5 gigabits per second in the previous year. So that's a big increase, but then when you think about it, when you look at total internet volume, 450 gigabits per second is really not all that much, is it? So, obviously we got some growth. You can see a nice trend there, trend line in the graph. It sat pretty flat for a long time. It has definitely been ramping up in the last year. So it's a good trend, but still quite a ways to go. All right, let's talk quickly about data center. We always ask about data center impact. We have a lot of data center operators. About 86% of our respondents this year operate data centers. So we think that's a really good sample size. 3/4 of those that operate data centers reported seeing DDoS attacks. Only 45% reported seeing them last year. So that's a pretty significant increase. What's some interesting things to pull out of that for me are over a third said they saw attacks that exceeded the total internet bandwidth to the data center. That's more than twice as many as responded last year to that question. So that's a significant event, right? We asked them of those that see the DDoS attacks, so right, 3/4 see DDoS attacks in their data centers. If you see them, how many do you see? Do you see, 10 or more per month? Do you see 100 or more per month? And it's interesting. So 10% saw over 100 attacks per month in their data center, over 100 DDoS incidents in their data center. So that's pretty frequent, clearly more than a couple a day, right? 81% told us they had operational expenses as a business impact of a DDoS attack in the data center. 35% told us they had customer churn due to DDoS attacks in the data center, and nearly a third, 27%, said they had revenue loss. So not only do we know this is happening frequently in the data center, we know it's having a real financial impact on those operators. So we asked about, okay, you're seeing this, what are you doing, right? Well, this is where the news gets a little bit better. So 83% tell us they have good visibility up to layer 4. but only 23% up to layer 7, right? So that's progress. It's good progress over last year. We see an overall increase in all types of security mechanisms employed within the data center. We do see that there's still a pretty heavy reliance on firewalls, IDS, IPS, which wouldn't be our first choice for DDoS mitigation, but there are some capabilities there depending on the vendor and the product, but certainly not your go-to solution for dealing with DDoS. We did see another increase, which was interesting. About 40% tell us they now offer a DDoS mitigation service within their data center, and 32%, an additional 32%, plan to in the future, like in the next year or so. So that's pretty good. That means within a year we should hopefully be looking at about nearly 3/4 offering DDoS mitigation services in the data center. And that runs the gamut. Some are offering it as a service for extra revenue. Some are offering it as a differentiator baked into the service, and you guys know where you are on that. All right, look quick at DNS visibility. So 85% of our respondents operate DNS services on their network, so again, pretty good sample size here. Mentioned this in the highlights at the beginning, 26%, so a little over a quarter, have no security group with formal responsibility for DNS security. That's a little bit of a scary number. I mean, what I'm hoping is that if you read between the lines, they're saying, well, we've just assigned that to the larger security group, so it's not explicitly defined. They just have to do everything, and it's presumed that it's within that, right? Somebody's doing something. Visibility at layer 3 and 4 is about the same for DNS services, but we did see an improvement in layer 7 visibility. So that's a trend we like to see. Improvements are good. And then we ask about DNS security. Again, over a third told us they experienced customer impacting DDoS attacks or events against their DNS infrastructure. That's a 10% increase over the previous year. We saw 35% attacks against authoritative servers, 23% against recursive. 20% told us they still don't restrict recursive lookups, and that's a 3-year running trend. So we really like to get those servers secured and locked down. And then we ask about DNSSEC, and the reason we ask about that, as I'm sure you're aware if you work with it, there's just such a huge ability for that reflection amplification attack when you include the very large keys in DNSSEC that you wouldn't have with just straight up DNS. The amplification rate goes up quite a bit on that reflection amplification attack. So 26%, a little over a quarter, said they have concerns about that aspect of DNSSEC. I mean, it's a solution that obviously is intended to secure DNS, but then can be exploited for an amplification reflection attack, and therefore while it's solving some problems, it's creating a new one, and hence we have a wonderful comment from one of our survey respondents that said, new and exciting ways for critical infrastructure services to break. Awesome. All right. Next, I want to look at mobile networks. We've been tracking this trend for a few years as well. 42% of our respondents operate mobile networks, up from only 32% last year, so we're getting better sample size there. 60% of those that responded have over 1 million subscribers. We're seeing very clear trend, rapid growth in LTE services. Over half globally have already deployed LTE, with another 14% planning services in 2014. And that may not be impressive numbers to you when you're looking at North America, but when you think about global adoption, that's a pretty good rate. We continue to be concerned about the mobile packet core. What we see is that for most mobile operators, they've got good visibility and security deployed at the GI, at the internet edge, right? But in the mobile packet core, not so much. So we are seeing some good improvements here. 65% are now telling us they have good visibility into that core, up from only 40% last year. Another nice bump in visibility into the user data plane, and up from only a third last year to nearly half. and as well as a huge increase in visibility into the control plane traffic. So these are all positive signs, good trends we like to see. Mobile network security in general, about 20% told us they had suffered outages, customer impacting outages due to a security incident, right? So that's stuff that's already happened. And 63% tell us they don't know what devices are compromised on their networks. That's a little bit of an increase from 57% last year. We also know it's not just compromised endpoints in the mobile networks that are a problem. It's also poorly implemented applications are impacting service. 35%, over a third told us that, right? And this is these packet storms where, like, a poorly written application on a cell phone is told to phone home to the servers go down, and so they poll it once an hour, and then they poll, once every 30 minutes, and then they poll once every minute, and then they poll once every 5 seconds, and next thing you got a packet storm from 1 million handheld devices, right? All right, so detection's getting better in the mobile networks. As you can see, 25% do see attacks against their mobile users, RAN, backhaul, or packet core. So that means that visibility is improving, right? They're seeing the attacks. It's not that they weren't happening before, they just weren't necessarily seeing them. So that's getting better. We see a big increase in attacks against that internet infrastructure, with DNS being the most common target. All right, so that's pretty much it. I wanted to go through the survey demographics with you quickly, just so you get an idea where all this stuff comes from. The survey was conducted in October 2013. It asked to reflect back 1 year and reflect forward 1 year, so you can kind of get a sense of that. We had 220 total respondents this year, which is a pretty good increase over the previous years. About 70%, a little over 70% of those respondents were service providers. Looking at the survey demographics from a geographic perspective, 38% of our respondents were in Europe. You can see 27% US and Canada, 18% Asia Pac, Latin America, Middle East, pretty close at 8 and 9%. I guess what that tells me is that Europeans like taking surveys. I don't know. More so than North Americans, apparently. What do those respondents do? So 58% are network or security or operations engineers. So, that's the people on the front lines. And then about slightly over a third were management or executives. So you get an idea of the perspective of the people that are responding. I think it's a pretty good cross-section. Then lastly, looking at the demographics, most of our respondents offer multiple services, right? So we ask about a bunch of categories. If you've ever taken this survey, if you offer all these services, we understand it can be a little bit challenging. There's a lot of questions. Just so you know, we've actually trimmed it quite a bit. We dropped down from like 180 questions to about 120 in the last survey, and we're trying to keep it concise, which is a lot of stuff we want to know about. So internet access and hosting co-location service were certainly the most common. Over half of our respondents offer cloud services and DNS services, but the clear trend is that most of you are offering more and more services, right? And so you've got more and more things you got to deal with, more and more things on your plate. So it's a big job. And then lastly, just taking a look at the Atlas demographics. I mentioned that before. That's our real-time sensor net. That operates, as I mentioned, it's actually about a little over 290 participants now. You can see the mix. We've got Europe, Asia, South America, North America. It's a pretty good spread, so we're seeing stuff around the globe. We're currently tracking a peak of a little over 80 terabits per second of real-time telemetry. So that's a pretty good view of what's happening on the internet. It's obviously not everything, but it's a significant percentage. So we think that gives us a pretty good view of what's happening out there. So that's it. I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming today. Appreciate your time. If there's any questions, I got a little bit of time left.
Questions?
Hi, you mentioned in the beginning...
Self-identify, please.
My name is Bill Norton. You mentioned in the beginning of the presentation 700 gigabits per second. Was that an aggregate number across all the different attacks?
Yes, correct. So you're talking about the NTP traffic that we monitored in the first quarter of this year. And so he's asking, the 700 gigabits per second. That is the aggregate of all NTP traffic we saw in that time. And that was the peak, but it was averaging about 350 gigabits per second early in the year. Yep. Anyone else? All right, thank you.